Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Hurley Heritage Society's January lecture. My name's Raleigh Greene. I'm the vice president of the organization and delighted to host tonight's presentation and welcome our guest presenter, Dr. Lorna Smedman. Before we get started, some quick notes. First, please be sure to mute yourself if you're not already to ensure that everybody can hear the guest speaker. During the presentation, if you have a question, please use the chat feature to send your questions, and they will be answered during the presentation or at the end. At the conclusion of the formal presentation, we will open things up to further questions, and you may unmute yourselves then. This presentation is also being recorded and will be posted to the Hurley Heritage Society website in the coming days. Tonight's presentation is brought to you by the Hurley Heritage Society. For almost 50 years, the Hurley Heritage Society has maintained and operated the Hurley Museum, which continues to be open and free to the public. We're an all-volunteer organization that also protects and preserves materials, documents, and artifacts pertaining to the Hurley area, and raise awareness and educate the public of the town's special heritage through events, lectures, programs, tours, and community initiatives. We very much welcome the community support with your volunteers, donations, and annual contributions. Tonight's lecture will be presented by Dr. Lorna Smedman. She's a resident of Hurley and a graduate of the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics and Naropa Institute, and a PhD in American Literature from the CUNY Graduate School. She's a key figure in the Eagle's Nest Lapala Project, funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and administered through the National Writing Project, focuses on the multiracial community living in the mountain above the town of Hurley between 1840 and 1950. We very much look forward to her presentation tonight. The Old Eagle Nester, Lost Legends, Origin Stories, and Historical Evidence. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lorna Smedman. Lorna?
What do I need to do, Raleigh? Share screen?
Yes, I'm going to. You now can click on share screen, the bottom green button, share screen. There you go.
Hey, okay. Hey, everybody. Hope that you're all here. Thanks for your patience. So, yeah, so every time I go through this draft, I change the title a little bit. So now I'm calling it The Old Eagle Nester, Some of the Lost History Behind the Lost Legends. And after I finished reading the last thing, I thought about going back and calling it a teeny weeny bit of the lost history behind the lost legends. But anyway, we'll stick with this title. I'm just curious before we start, and do we have that little hand button anywhere where people can virtually raise their hand? I'm just curious how many people know this. I hope that at the end of the lecture you're inspired to read it and not the opposite. But okay, and I'm going to be reading notes and going through the slides. The Old Eagle Nesters, some of the lost history behind the lost legends. After I bought my cabin on Eagle's Nest Road about 20 years ago, one of my neighbors gave me a copy of Doris West Brooks' book, The Old Eagle Nester, The Lost Legends of the Catskills. I've continued the tradition by giving copies to other new residents on the hill, explaining that, yeah, the title refers to our road, even though the stories in the book take place up near Tannersville, somewhere in Greene County. I like this book a lot. West Brooks deftly weaves together vignettes about daily life in the small town of East Jewett in the late 19th century, farmers banding together to hunt a painter cat, mountain lion, people using a scrap of red flannel to signal that someone inside has a dreaded contagious disease, the spoiled city mouse cousin from Kingston who gains her health and a healthy appreciation of her country mouse cousins who know many inventive ways to amuse themselves after their chores are done. People sometimes encounter ghosts, human or animal, and they pay attention to omens, good and bad. At one point, 4 enterprising families move up into the spruce woods to start a lumbering business with their own sawmill, even though this puts them at some remove from the town. Their kids had a long hike up and over Dutcher Pass when school was in session. So they are startled when an old woman they don't know suddenly appears in their camp, wanting to trade some baskets for a hen and some fertile eggs. She is short, bent over, carrying a machete and a bunch of baskets, and she is not white, although it was hard to tell just what color she was. She wasn't really black. She also speaks with a dialect that the white lumber camp settlers can't understand at first. Nee eights for little chickies, nee hain, possibly a low German dialect. If that was it, the folks in the camp probably wouldn't understand it because they were of English origin. Who was she and where was she from? The women can't quite make coherent sense of the cues, ambiguous racial identity, unfamiliar dialect, and the unorthodox gender behavior. None of their grandmothers would ever be wandering through these woods alone. The closest association they can make is with the gypsy-like people peddling their baskets on the streets of Catskills, the big towns along the Hudson River, where folks in the East Kill Valley occasionally travel to shop or trade goods or catch the train. In Doris West Brooks' tale, the old woman stays in the vicinity for the whole summer. Beavers have created a large swamp next to one of the waterways, and this is where she gets her basket making materials. The small community at the lumber camp suddenly realizes how handy these are. Everyone in the settlement began to wonder just what they had done without the baskets for so long. But once they get a taste of the tea the old woman offers, she's got a pot perpetually brewing outside the trapper's hut she settled into. They end up scrounging through their possessions to find something else they can barter for some more. Somehow, the tea makes everyone happier. People went around in the best of health, humming and whistling, doing their chores. Some, if the truth be known, would even snatch a nap in the afternoon. Naps, scandalous for these people whose ancestors had come over from England, these Methodists who not only did not partake of spirited drink, but who also did not play card games or most especially take the Lord's name in vain. At the end of the summer, the families decide to move to a town in the valley. After 2 generations, all the good timber has been cut, and they want to be closer to the school and the church and the doctor down below. Although they've been conducting business with the old woman for months, the adults in the camp don't appear to have learned her name. They refer to her as the old woman of the swamp. Supposedly, the kids who have been hanging out with her, listening to her stories about voodoo and ghosts, Indian legends and divination, have heard her life story and where she was from originally, but by some tacit agreement, they never reveal this information, alas. Did this person, the old woman of the swamp, actually appear in a Catskill Mountain lumber camp circa 1880? I'm guessing at that date, since these would have been stories that the author heard from her grandparents. In her prologue, Doris West Brooks explains that most of the incidents and characters in the book are fictitious, based on oral history she collected and stories she heard from her family. This is just a grab from the back book cover. And I guess she was a really dedicated collector of folklore and folk tales. She had published 2 volumes of short stories and tall tales, and then this book. She had a lot of other community activities on her resume, including board member at the Mountaintop Historical Society. The gypsy-like basket peddlers that her relatives remembered seeing in Catskill and Hudson might have been some of the people known as the pond shiners, who made high-quality splint baskets, a skill they attribute to their Native American ancestry. I don't know if anyone's ever come across one of these. Now I have to, someone remind me how I see my slide. Oh, here's notes. Okay. And the people who were once called the pond shiners, is a little bit of a derogatory term, the Conic Hills people, lived in the up on the mountain for quite a long time. I'll just read this one thing. What brought the families to that location, heavily wooded and ill-suited to cultivation, is contested. The proper family's oral history suggests their early 19th century forebears were pulled toward a life not tied, let's see, to the rigors of agricultural labor. Although basket making with hand-hewn timber can hardly be called unrigorous. Further on in the book, the old woman of the swamp reappears as a fortune teller in Cairo. She reads the tea leaves from that herbal brew she's always making. West Brooks' relatives may have also encountered women working as fortune tellers on their trip to town. In the late 1880s, the Kingston Freeman ran regular reports about the Roma immigrants who were traveling around New York State and regularly offering fortune telling. So here's just a few clips from the Freeman, 1889. And there were many, many more of these. They really kept track of them. I guess if you wanted to go get your fortune told, you'd be able to do so by reading the paper. Gypsies are camping in Port Ewan. The queen of the camp tells fortunes. So, and here's a photograph of a Roma camp, one of the Roma camps in Inwood, New York, 1904. I sort of love this clipping here. This is when obviously the Freeman needed to fill up space in the newspaper. We have dandelions and daisies. Small green worms are playing havoc with currant and gooseberry bushes. A gypsy camp near the city hall proved an attraction for strollers, and people say they saw a meteor in the northern heavens last night. So often when people talk about the multiracial families, often the old term gypsy is thrown around, but it turns out that there were some Roma families from England who immigrated to New York in the 1880s and traveled throughout the state in wagons, covered wagons, and often very highly decorated wagons, peddling handcrafted wares, trading horses, and the women specialized in telling fortunes. I listened to an oral history with Jenny Ostrander from Accord. She was born in 1902. And she remembers Roma caravans coming to Accord even into the 1930s. And the story that everybody heard, of course, the kids were kind of scared of them, especially the women. But the women would read fortunes in the front room, and supposedly the kids would run around the house burgling whatever they could find. She also remembers people gathering regularly to tell ghost stories, and that they were very conscientious about omens, reading omens. So when we get further and people who went up into the mountains, because they thought, oh, here are some backwards people up here who are so remote that they still are following these old traditions of storytelling. They could have just gone down the road to Accord, which was hardly a remote community, and the people there were telling sometimes the exact same stories. Peddling handmade baskets or brooms or wooden bowls or herbal medicine, useful products that didn't require any expenses beyond gathering the right natural materials and having the right skills to craft them, became part of the survival strategy for some Native American people who were displaced from their homelands, but other groups who were living on the margins adopted this practice as well. In her book, Black Walden, Slavery and Its Aftermath in Concord, Massachusetts, Elise Lemire provides detailed accounts about the lives of the formerly enslaved Black people who ended up living in the woods near Walden Pond in the late 18th century, several decades before Henry David Thoreau. Only one woman had managed to keep a spinning wheel and made linen thread for clients who supplied the flax. Others made baskets and brooms, repaired rush-bottom chairs, or wove rush mats. Another woman gained a reputation as a canny fortune teller. So here's the same ways of making a little bit of money, showing up again and again. The recompense for these activities was meager, but helped them to live as independent operators instead of remaining at households or farms where they would have still been under the control of their former enslavers. Living on the margins. Throughout the Hudson Valley, people who were ostracized because of their class status, for instance, indentured servants of European ancestry, racial heritage, Black people, Native Americans, or especially in a society where racial identity had become so closely aligned with social and economic power structures for people with mixed racial backgrounds. And some of these groups established outlier communities on land that no one else wanted, where they resisted assimilation into a culture that offered them such limited choices. Okay, let me go through this one a little bit. So here's just a small list of some of the racially mixed communities in the Hudson Valley. And there's many other communities all over the country. Hundreds of communities like this. I'll just go through this list a little bit. Ramapo Muncie Lenape Nation, who used to be derogatorily known as Jackson Whites, on the New York-New Jersey border. They now have gotten recognition from New Jersey state of New Jersey as a sovereign nation. The Binney Waters, these were families living around the 5 Binney Water lakes in Hurley and Rosendale. And in 1877, someone named Richard Dugdale did a pseudoscientific genealogical study about the families there, using the pseudonym the Jukes. And this became really the start of the eugenics movement in this country. And then, it was already starting in other parts of the world. There was a community in Pangyang, the Pangyangers in Lloyd, the Traps in the Shawangunk Mountains, the Van Gilders. They were the focus of another eugenics study in 1913. The Yahoos in Warwarsing, La Pala in Marbletown, and Eagle's Nest on Hurley Mountain. So some of these communities had racially mixed families living there, and some of them, like for instance, La Pala and Eagle's Nest, I would say they're racially mixed, but they were also multiracial, meaning that Black families, people of color, and white families were living as neighbors in close proximity. which was certainly in the late 1800s and even well into the 1900s, unusual when segregated housing had become such a norm. So we're looking at this list, and here's one of the big questions I was wondering about for this lecture. Why did Doris West Brooks choose Eagle's Nest as the identity for her title character? The old eagle nester of the swamp is partly a composite of local characters who might have appeared in Greene County around the turn of the century: basket peddler, medicine woman, fortune teller, Methodist revival meeting participant. She may not have a given name, but West Brooks provides her with a lineage by having her come from Eagle's Nest. So here's, this is the prologue to the book. I'll just read it here from the screen. Although the places in my stories are real, the people and events I write about are fictitious, with the following exceptions. The Widow Van Cott, this was a chapter about a Methodist revival conference. And then the other supposedly real people are, and she doesn't pinpoint this one woman, but the Eagles Nesters are a very old clan of a mix of Esopus Indians and Dutch settlers and date back to the mid-1600s. They later welcomed runaway slaves from the South into their midst and did fashion baskets for barter and trade. They lived just west of Kingston at a place called Eagle's Nest Hill. It's the first time I've heard that particular version. So named for the many eagles that used to nest there in the tops of the tall pine trees. So I'm sure many of you have heard this version or similar versions, right, to the origin story. You know, when did Eagle's Nest start? How did this community get its start? And you notice that last sentence has a citation, right? So she's giving a citation to Carl Karmer. So there was my first clue. Where did she get this story from? And Carl Karmer was a very popular author, and his book, The Hudson, published in 1939, was really a bestseller. It was part of something called the Rivers of America series. The series had hired well-known writers and poets to track down the geography, events, and people who made the culture of different regions of the country distinctive. Karmer was from upstate New York and had a particular interest in the state's history and folklore. In one of the last chapters, chapter 34, which is called Witches Make Star Tracks, not Star Trek, Star Tracks. And this chapter is about visits he made to 3 racially mixed communities, including Eagles Nest, Hurley. In the previous chapter, he managed to get lumberjacks at a camp in the Adirondacks to sing some of their authentic songs, not the recycled stuff that they performed for the tourists. He expected to find a similar caliber of authentic folklore from these mountain people, particularly stories about witchcraft and ghosts. This expectation was based on his assumption that these communities were, quote, small sociological islands set in the waters of New York State's civilization. And with that comment, you can see he was buying into the perception that people in these remote outcast communities had probably been living in isolation for generations, cut off from the wonderful and terrible influences of modern American consumer culture. So he was really expecting to find a kind of time capsule, right? These people were so untouched by modern life that he could really find the good folklore, the good witch stories. West Brooks cites Karmer for the information about how Eagle's Nest got its name. So if you remember her last bit about the so named for the many eagles that used to nest there in the tops of the tall trees. So this is This is in Carmer's introduction to his visit to Eagle's Nest. Once the dark pines grew so tall on Eagle's Nest that they shut out the daylight for miles around, the old people say. Eagles made their nests in the topmost branches that were close to the stars. The pines are not so tall now, but they still tower above the low homes of the folks who do as they damned please. On a little cleared plateau at the top of an almost impassable road, a spreading frame house shelters some of them. And so this, again, this is a story that is probably well known to many people. How did Eagle's Nest get its name? There's a couple other versions, but usually it's that, you know, there used to be eagles making their nests in these tall trees. I'm a little skeptical because it seems to me that eagles usually make nests on the borders of a body of water, like a lake or a big stream, and there's none of those up on Eagle's Nest. But anyway, that's one of the big stories. And I'm just juxtaposing this description with, this is a photo taken from South Farm, which is just past the Wine Coop estate, circa 1900. And you can see what a towering mountain. Wow. How could you ever get up there? You know, it's just gigantic. And then there's a one poor leftover pine tree, white pine standing there. And it's lonesome. So I can imagine that Doris West Brooks was particularly interested in this chapter since she shared Carmer's interest in folk stories. As it turned out, the residents on Eagle's Nest were willing to talk about good luck signs, like finding a horseshoe with 5 nails, bad luck signs, finding a 5-leaf clover, killing a black cat, hitting someone with a broom, but they refused to tell any witch stories. The folks in the Taconic Hills made up for that. And while Neil Hasbrook and Sarah Snyder Hasbrook gave details about their racially mixed heritage, Mohican, Black, and Dutch on his side, Native American and Black on hers, this chapter doesn't include the other details she included in her Eagle's Nest origin story, the beginnings in the 1600s, the fugitive slaves from the South, or the basket making. Where did West Brooks find this information? So, and as it turns out, Carl Carmer probably never even visited Eagle's Nest. His friend Croswell Bowen did a lot of the footwork and field work for him, and typed up his notes every night and sent them to Carmer in letters. So, and he was also a talented photographer. So this very iconic photo of Neil, this is Neil Hasbrook here, is taken by Croswell Bowen. In the book itself, they appear under the pseudonyms Jacob Flotter and Stella Yellowbird. And that particular pseudonym probably came about because Sarah Hasbrook told Bowen that before she was married, her name was Mary Brown Thrush. So some information about her native heritage there. But there's nothing in the chapter about an origin story. Okay. Probable source is a 1969 article from the Kingston Daily Freeman. The original article was called, the title was called Different Because of Their Otherness. And then in 1976, the Freeman reprinted this in their July 4th, this is a special edition for July 4th, a centennial or bicentennial. Important stories about local history, and this was included. This little photo with all, it's kind of in all the different columns. Well, another one of my neighbors discovered this taped to their basement wall when they first moved into their house in the 1970s. And so took a photo of it and passed it around. The journalist, who's not named in the later version, Toby Geertsema, reviewed several theories about how and when the triracial community on Hurley Mountain came into being. According to her, the most common story is that enslaved Black men were brought up from the South to work on the Delaware and Hudson Canal. When that task was completed in 1828, some of these men slipped away and were accepted into a community that already existed on Eagle's Nest. So, and I think Bill Merchant might be here, but I contacted Bill Merchant, who's the curator and historian at the D&H Canal Historical Society, about this claim. And he said that he had never come across any information confirming that story. And he knows a lot of the information. So no evidence about enslaved people being imported for that particular task. Geertsema then proposed another rather fanciful theory. And here, I'll read parts of this. We are reminded that during the Second Esopus War, some 200 men, including over 40 Indians and more than half a dozen Negroes, left Kingston on July 26, 1663, to destroy and burn an Indian fort to the southwest. It is not inconceivable that some of the red men and or Black men, this is language from many decades ago, deserted the hated white ranks and found their way to Eagle's Nest, where perhaps even then other Indians and runaway slaves were already living, even so early as the late 1600s. So I think this sounds like a good possibility for where Doris West Brooks got her origin story about the enslaved Black canal workers, and then, or Black, enslaved people from the South, taking their freedom when they got up here, and also this story about 1600s. So I have to say I give her credit for imagining this scenario, but and indeed Peter Stuyvesant sent Captain Krieger up to Hurley after the Second Esopus Dutch War, and he had 200 men in his militia. One of the aides from Long Island had recruited 40 Native American men from Long Island, and then the company also brought 7 enslaved Black men who, who knows, maybe they were supposed to do all the cooking and the lugging. However, the idea that, first of all, that the native men from Long Island probably had not been conscripted. They had made, for some reason, they had made a deal and they wanted to participate in this mission, so they wouldn't have been interested in deserting. And if any of the 7 enslaved Black men had attempted to escape, it seems very likely that Krieger would have redirected some of his search parties to find them. And I don't think it would have taken very long if they were just in the Hurley Patentee woods. So it's also, the journalist is erroneously applying views from 1969 about racial identity and racial solidarity to a situation in the 17th century. And the political alliances and breaking alliances and remaking alliances between Native American groups and colonialists were so complicated and shifting. So much more difficult to read on the surface than she makes out. So what is the actual story? My research project began almost 3 years ago after I read this footnote in Riley Rhodes' book, Winslow Homer, From Poetry to Fiction. Here's the quote. It was during the Civil War that freed or escaping slaves, Native Americans, and some Dutch-speaking migrants settled Eagle's Nest. The Hurley Mountain people living on Eagle's Nest have a unique history, but few details are known. So I read this, I was at the cabin, it was locked down, beginning of the pandemic, and suddenly it just hit me. I said, oh, this is a crazy version, right? Now the timeline has shifted to Civil War. Who were these Dutch-speaking migrants? What? In 1865? And this is what inspired me to say, well, let me see if I can find some details. You know, are there any details? Where are they? There has to be some details. So I decided to start digging around, and I'm still digging. And I've dug myself into a very deep hole, and there's always a new rabbit hole to fall into. So I'm gonna shift now to some of the stuff that I've been looking at and things that are shaping things that I'm using to try to get a sense of the details of the history. So this is a map of the 1708 division of the Hurley Patentee Woods. At first it was the Hardenberg, the huge part of the huge Hardenberg tract, and it was divided as part of Hurley in 1708. So you see here that it's here's it's divided into 9 lots. There you go. Fortunately, I didn't locate the actual date for this. And then those lots were then subdivided, sliced and diced, sold, resold, rented, leased. So these woods were a very busy place, you know, or at least claimed. They were very claimed, and they were also busy because these were wood lots. The Dutch colonists, you know, were really eager to get possession of the fertile farmlands along the creek, the land that the Esopus Muncie had farmed for millennia, but they also wanted the woods because they needed fuel and timber. Okay, that. Let's give one more slide about this to show how people used this property. This, you know, you can't read it here. My slide notes are missing. So anyway, a deed between someone named Elias Ostrander, who was from Woodstock, and the Hurley Patentees, 1788, 80 years after that first division. And it's a deed he wants to use 60 acres kind of at the very end of the Patentee Woods that border Woodstock for timber, hauling stone, and bringing his cattle to browse in waste areas. So a multi-purpose. So even here are these woods. They're not, you know, they're not primeval woods, but even back then the woods were really being used for many resources, including bringing your cattle into the woods, or any area that would have been a little bit of a pasture or had a little bit of shrubs and plants for them to eat during the summer. Okay. So here's the maps. They're very busy places. Now we'll sort of fast forward into the 19th century. The first deed that I was able to find for, I'm saying householder deed because there's a lot of landowners, but the first person to buy a deed because they wanted to set up their household was from 1840. Edward Snyder and Sons paid $20 for 1 acre. They bought it from Derek Wynkoop. And whether this was a cash deal, it might have more likely been a bartering. People were still doing a lot of bartering then. So it could have been $20 worth of labor over a certain amount of period. And I'll just read this little description of the area. All that certain lot, piece, or parcel of land situated, lying, or being in the town of Hurley, northerly of the old brink pasture. So there was an old brink pasture. There was also a Wynkoop pasture. So these big landowners along the flats, Hurley Mountain Road, nearest ones, each had their own area where they were bringing their cattle up in the summer. Bounded by woodlands, formerly known as the Hurley Commons on the west side of the Esopus Creek. And one thing here, when the Patentee Woods was first subdivided in these previous pictures here, these previous maps, it appears that there might have been some areas in here that were designated as commons areas. There was several others in Hurley. So this would be areas people who were not landowners, or they didn't have, and they didn't own a wood lot, could go in there for wood, for a certain amount of wood, or bring their cows there to graze, or what other resources that were there. In the early 1800s, New York State made a law to privatize all the commons areas. So this is maybe one reason that the Wynkoops decided, okay, let's start selling off. This is pretty crappy land, right? You can't, it's on the hill. There's not much dirt. The water sources are sometimes iffy, but if somebody wants to take it, let's do it. Another interesting thing here is this 1 acre of land, which is nearly enclosed by fences. So by 1840, right, the land has already been parceled out and fenced, and the same acre that is now possessed by Edward Snyder. So the Snyder family was, at least in 1840, already living there, and maybe had already built a house. And, possibly they were there because they were doing work for Derek Wynkoop, right? Maybe herding his cattle and building the fences. And this is I wouldn't call it a fence, it's a stone wall, but I don't know if this is exactly what they were talking about. But these walls, there's several of these walls that still enclose the original Snyder property. The second deed that I found was 5 years later. Andreas Vandemark from Marbletown bought 1 acre of land for $35 from the other Wynkoop brother, George. And he was married and had 6 kids, and he would live there, and 2 of his sons would end up living on Eagle's Nest for the rest of their lives. So here right away by 1840, 1845, you have 1 family, people of color, and 1 white family buying property in this area. So it already starts to be a somewhat unusual arrangement at the time. And that's how it went from then on. So here's just some of the land deeds from the first 30 years. Snyder, Vandemark. Edward Snyder must have died shortly after. Anyway, he died before 1850 because he's not in the census. He first shows up in the records in 1820 as head of household, free person of color. In Hurley in 1830, he's head of household in Marbletown, comes back to Hurley, and then ends up getting land, 1 acre. His two sons, who are named in the deed as his heirs, by 1847, one of the sons sells his part of the inheritance, half of an acre, back to one of the wine cooks for $5. So buying land was an accomplishment, but hanging on to it was not always easy. There were taxes. They couldn't have been huge, but these were people who were really living on the margins, right? They did not have the wherewithal to, sometimes come up with $5 or $7. That would have been too much. Then further on, Benjamin Reed and Havens ended up, they buy 6 acres. They had a little farm. It seems as if they were renting out teams of oxen, right, to farmers around the area. Peter Conway, Edward and Margaret Coffey, kind of interesting story. They're Irish immigrants. And here's the big difference. They buy 1 acre, and I think it had a house on it. A lot more money, $175 from CUNY DeWitt. And they stayed there less than 10 years and made a profit. So they were sort of flipping. They were already like buying this property and flipping it. It's further down the hill. There was a barn, there was a house. I don't know why it was considered so much more valuable. And these two sisters, Maria Bush and Hester Bush Ellsworth, buy land, and there's a lot of Ellsworth families that would come in and buy land and make houses on other relatives' land for the next few decades after that. And then there's no deed showing this, but Maria DeWitt and her daughter and other children and grandchildren purchased the house at the very top of the hill and stayed there for several generations. And they were, so from this whole list, Edward Snyder, that family was people of color, and Maria DeWitt was a person of color, and everybody else identified as white. Now, some of these people and some of the names are identified with Binney water names, right? And back in the day, there would have been a lot of ostracization, right? So people would hear your last name and immediately make a lot of assumptions about who you were. So that's one, could be that's one reason that these poor lower class white families were also moving to an area that was considered kind of off the beaten track and the outcasts. And all of these families, there's a few things that when you study the census records enough, and you can't get a real good portrait, but you can get some information. Many of them were illiterate, and so their children were illiterate, even though the one-room schoolhouse was right down the hill at the foot of the hill. So at one point, at first, I was sort of assuming that this was because the kids were sent out to work when they were quite young. One young woman is sent out to work in a hotel in Kingston when she's 12 years old. But the other thing was that these were families who did not want to assimilate with mainstream culture and society. And certainly public schooling was one of the tools for doing that. So I think that's also explains why none of the kids were going to school. This is the Eagle's Nest didn't show up on the 1855 survey map of Hurley. And again, these survey maps, there's a lag, but it does show up in the 1875 map. And these are not all the landowners, but here we have Maria DeWitt living at the top of the hill. Here's Calvin Snyder, kind of in the middle of the hill. Here's a few people down on one of the spur roads. Here's Mrs. Vandermark and Edward and Margaret Coffey down here. In around this time here, around 1894, Richard DeLisser published in several volumes books called Picturesque Ulster. And so a lot of photographs. He would usually then he would write or have somebody write a real nice local history or description, right, of this building or house or church or whatever. And this is a photograph that just appeared with the caption was just Eagle's Nest residence, period. Nobody wrote anything about it. So besides lack of education, skin color, one of the defining characteristics, right, that started being associated with the Eagle's Nesters was their kind of small, a little rundown log houses. So that a log cabin was much less valuable than having a frame house, certainly less valuable than a stone house, and would become part of, why can't they have better houses? Why are they still living in this, log cabin? It's unclear so far where exactly this cabin was located, whose cabin this was. And a lot of the families on the hill had really big families. So for instance, Calvin Snyder and his wife throughout their life had 15 children, and not all of them survived to adulthood. So this would have been a cozy, quite a cozy habitation for many of those families. Do I have time here? Okay. And I'm doing this screenshot about Calvin Snyder because I have probably found the most information about him. 1824 to 1906. His wife was Dinah Schoonmaker. They had 15 children, 13 girls and 2 boys. Only one son survived to adulthood, and that was Samson Snyder. He stayed on the hill for all of his life. Very interesting, when Calvin Snyder died in 1906, the Freeman ran this, rather extensive obituary. This is not a standard obituary. It's more like a newspaper article. And it gives a lot of details about his life, including his occupations. He had worked as a well digger, and he was best known for more than a generation. He spent his time in peddling sassafras and other roots and herbs, which he gathered on the hills near Hurley. So here, going back again to this very old strategy for people living on the margins to, here was something that you could make a little money with your skills, and just go out and forage. You didn't have to have any overhead, right? Other peddlers, you'd have to buy, you have to buy a bunch of buttons and then hopefully make your money back, right? So there weren't that, in this case, you didn't have to do that. You just had to prepare the stuff and then go out and be a good peddler, which obviously he was. He worked, you know, he had a very loyal clientele. There's another earlier newspaper article where he is peddling horseradish, growing horseradish and peddling. So a real niche, here's a niche market if there ever was one. But and then in the 1900 and 1905 census, there was a little category, and he's listed as, you know, you have your occupation, and then are you a worker, are you an employer, or are you OA, your own account? So part of the reason for choosing to live, you know, in a little log cabin, right, make do cabin, away from the mainstream and follow these kind of entrepreneurial occupations was because he was his own boss his whole life. You know, he didn't work for anybody else. He worked for himself, and ended up started with the 1 acre and had 13 acres conjoined by the time he died in 1906. So, and then back to sassafras. So this goes back to something for years I have been really curious, like what was in that tea, right? That addictive tea that the old eagle nester was making. And there's hints in the book. She's always going out and trying to find foxfire, the phosphorescent fungi, and drying it and putting that in the tea. Which I'm not sure, as far as I know, that's probably not very tasty, and people sometimes get in the book. There's several people who get stomach cramps when they come in contact with this glow in the dark fungus. And if it's, you know, if it's jack-o'-lantern, then you would be in trouble. But when a friend of mine, in regard to Calvin Snyder, sent me some information about sassafras. So it's a native plant. Many people are probably familiar with it, right? The 3 different kinds of leaves, right? The mitten, the 3 fingers, and the no lobes. Had been used by Native American people for, you know, for many different purposes, and other herbal healers, pain reliever, stimulant, and it's the flavor of root beer. It was also one of the first important exports from colonial Jamestown, or, you know, the first English colonies, back to Europe. And at this point, the FDA has banned the use of sassafras oil in food or as a food additive because saffrole might be carcinogenic. And it turns out saffrole is also a component in the drug MDA, which is also known as ecstasy. So suddenly I was like, huh, maybe that's what was about. Tea that made everybody so happy and relaxed and more loving and, you know, easier to get along with and take a nap on top of it. So I think they would recognize the taste if that's what it was, but just throwing it out there. That's that's one of my theories. So so this is just a little bit about the Riley talked about the NEH funded project, Eagles Nest Road and Lapala project. I'm just very quickly, there's a website, hurleymountain.com, Facebook page, Life on Eagles Nest in Lapala. Upcoming March 3 and 4, there's going to be a theater production by David Gonzalez at the Dutch Reformed Church. I don't even know what the title of it is at this point, if it has a title. And then the Hurley Heritage Museum has scheduled an exhibit about the history of Eagles Nest Road that will be opening in May of this year, 2023. And I'm really thinking about that more as not an exhibit. As you see in my slide presentation, there's not a lot to show. You know, there's not a lot of material culture in this history. So, you know, just boring stuff like deeds and maps and census records. But I'm thinking of it more as an inquiry, and hopefully the committee that's just started to work on this, we really want a lot of community input and engagement, because there's a lot of lost history in Hurley. You know, parts of the history are so well documented and known backwards and forwards, but there's lots of areas of the history and different people who live in town that have not been explored or have been, and a lot of it is probably lost, which is really sad. So the sooner we start collecting this stuff, the better. So just put that on your radar. And
Lorna, someone asked which Dutch Reformed church is it going to be? Is it in Kingston?
Sorry, Kingston Dutch Reformed Church.
Yep.
Okay, so that's it, guys. Let me, how do I get on here? Escape.
This is a great time now for people to ask. Thank you, Lorna. That was wonderful. Very informative. And it seems like that you've done a lot of work already. And it seems like there's a lot more that can be done to keep to make us more aware of the fascinating history of Eagle's Nest and communities like that around the Hudson Valley. This is a great time for people to shoot some questions to Lorna at this point, or to share some additional thoughts. Some people have chimed in the chat about during your presentation.
Okay, so the play is called, is Falcon Ridge, and I hope I got the date right. Okay, let's see. So Riley, you want me to just read through these and?
Sure.
Or do you want people to?
Let's see. You can go ahead and read them. Let's see.
Okay, so here's, I think the first, there's a lot of stuff about my, okay, what are the eugenic studies referred to in the list of communities? And should I stop sharing, or maybe it's more useful?
You can continue to share if you'd like.
So the Jukes, published in 1877, was the first. Doug Dale, it looks very, he was really trying to be very scientific. So he presented this whole genealogy of, I think, 7 generations of families who were living near the Binneywater Lakes. But he then gives descriptions of them, and the descriptions are really, they're so disturbing to read now. And so people were, so everything about their way of life, he interpreted as a moral or social defect. And partly one of his questions when he did the study was, is poverty genetic, or is it a result of environment? Is criminal behavior genetic, or you know, a result of your upbringing? So he kind of came down in the middle with Jukes, but this inspired there. Altogether, I think there were 13 or 14 of these. I'm going to say in air quotes, genealogical. They were really, really bad science and bad. There was no scientific methodology used. And it ended up that every study then targeted another characteristic. You know, laziness was one of these defective traits that were genetic. And laziness meant you didn't necessarily want to have a low-paid job on a farm, right? You preferred to hunt, forage, peddle baskets, and go fishing during fishing season and be your own boss. So that was the Binney Waters, the Jukes. And then the Van Gilders, the book was, these pseudoscientists always use pseudonyms. NAMS was man, the word man spelled backwards, was another one. And there's, I think, 14 altogether. The Calicax was another one that was quite well known. And so, for instance, just in talking about methodology, Dugdale presented this as 7 generations of the same family. And then it turns out he was looking at 42 different families. So it just collapsed together. Okay, does that answer your question?
Did you see Bill Merchant's comment? In fact, I found no indication Black people worked on the construction, probably because the Irish fought for the work. He says Black people worked on the canal from the start, however, but that is post New York State manumission.
Right. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Sounds like Calvin Snyder was a tradition keeper. And again, I think it's a little tricky to make immediate assumptions, because like the example with Black Walden, here was a group of people who adopted survival strategies that had probably been considered or defined as Native American traditions, but they very quickly adopted them for their own uses. So, but it's very likely, yeah. Okay. Pond Shiners, POND, and oh, did I leave? I left them off. I left them off this list here. Bad editing. Another kind of, and some of these names are quite derogatory. Another name for that same group of people, the Takana Kills people, were bushwhackers. So those 2 names. Yeah, Jukes is available. You can see some of these you can find online. Any other questions or comments or things to add, or things that anybody wants, that thinks that we local historians need to do a better job investigating?
Well, Lorna, I'm curious to know, are there any structures left from that time period on Eagle's Nest? Are there any houses or foundations or structures that are still visible today? From that era, from the
there's I think that the Maria DeWitt House, which is the Smolin House, which has now gone through several other owners. The original structure might have been from 1875 there. One of the Vandermark sons, his house from 1895 is still there. And Edward and Margaret Coffey, who spent all that money on the property, the foundations of that house are still intact, but the house has been remodeled and so many times. So again, hard to, when you go in there, which are the old beams and which are the old floorboards. But otherwise, and there's one old cabin cellar, sort of dug in the ground and lined with stone, that's still on somebody's property, which gives you a really absolutely clear idea of the footprint of these houses. Very, very small. And then the stone walls around the Snyder property. So I think that's it. That's as far as I know.
There are some additional questions that have come in. Have you have a comment on the number of people of color in the population? I'm not sure. I guess that's about Eagles Nest.
Are you accepting?
Yes.
Oh, okay. That's for me. I recently examined the population figures in the 1790 census, and generally people are not aware of how many people of color, enslaved people, were present in the regular population at that time. In Kingston alone, just Kingston, there were 18% of the population were people of color. So,
yeah. Okay.
So
go ahead, Hilda. Sorry. Hilda.
Well, my only comment is that I think the lot of the conjecture about where Black people in a given population came from, it is not knowledgeable. It comes from lack of knowledge about the high presence of them in the population from the earliest times. So I just wanted to fill that in. Thank you for your presentation.
Did you look at the Hurley figures?
No, you know all the rabbit holes we could fall down.
Yeah, and this is one of the biggest, a really classic example of the people's perception. Like, I think everyone knows there was slavery in this area, but many people don't understand that, or don't realize that Ulster County had one of the highest.
Yes, yes, and that New York,
Yeah,
in the middle states, New York City was the largest place of exchange and sale of slaves in the 16th, in the 17th and 18th century into the night. So yeah, they don't realize that, and people owned, families in Ulster County could own as many as 12 to 15 slaves.
So
and they lived very closely with the people who owned them.
In 1790, and again, many, Ulster County had a very high percentage of enslaved people. 1790, 29% of the total population in Hurley were enslaved Black people. 29% in 1790. That is way higher than any other town for some reason. And when I first, making numbers on the back of an envelope, saw that, I was stunned. I was like, what? That, this 1/3 of the population.
Yes. When I did this analysis and shared the information with Friends of Historic Kingston people, we were all very surprised, very surprised. So it led to a whole lot of other questions and greater understanding. We think generally when we hear slavery, we think of plantation slavery, and it was entirely a different picture in the middle states of the colonies. Different situation entirely.
And so, and when I saw that and sort of saw the investment in the system of slavery in this county and in this town, the story, which is a little bit romantic about enslaved people escaping and finding haven with Native American people who had managed to find places to live. They had been dispossessed of so much of their land, but they were still in Hurley in Ulster County and in the woods, in the Hurley woods. So it's a little bit of a romantic idea to me, to my mind, especially when you think there was a huge investment. And if an enslaved person ran away, there was going to be a lot of energy put into finding them and bringing them back. And Eagle's Nest Road is not that far from any of the big farms there. So that's never quite made logical sense to me. You know, that story that Seema told, you know, from that somehow in the 1600s, right? It makes it sound like it wasn't that hard to escape. And there were so many, the system was really built to prevent that from happening. But that's something that really needs to be explored. All of the, you know, all of those questions. Yeah. Okay, Doug Adele worked in the prison system, and he was a reformer. I'm just reading. This is one of Linda's comments. Yeah, that's how he ended up he went to some prisons in Ulster County, and then kind of noticed that a couple of the men in the prisons were related. You know, they were cousins, and then that's how he got on this idea to go into some of these areas and see how everybody else was related. And very interesting here, very interesting. Doug Adele was I think from New York City. His main informant when he did his interviews for this book was Dr. Peter Crispell, who lived on Hurley Mountain Road. So Dr. Crispell would have really known a lot of families in the area intimately as a doctor. And he then kind of unloaded a lot of gossip and understanding, and, you know, a lot of the information that Dugdale used was from him. Okay, somebody said I got the book. I hope that's what you're talking about. Doris West Brooks book. Okay, any other questions, or if I missed a question?
Any other questions for Lorna? Okay, were the Dutch the only Europeans in this area who were slave traders? Do you have any comment on that, Lorna?
The British were slave traders as well, and I don't remember offhand when Britain stopped the slave trade.
Well, they stopped, I believe slavery was abolished in Great Britain in the 1840s.
But I don't know if they had stopped. So anyway, but certainly the English colonies were also bringing in a lot of slaves. Some of there were different, in different time periods. So the Dutch West Indies Company, they're Dutch West Indies. So for in different time periods, most of the enslaved people would have been brought from the West Indies or the Caribbean, not directly from Africa. And then that changed at different time periods. So that's a different, you know, again, that's something that people don't realize, like what, you know. So
I believe Britain abolished the slave trade in the late 1700s.
Yeah, it was
approximately 1780, 1785. But in New York City, they had a slave market erected at the foot of Wall Street in 1711. So the British definitely, or people of British origin, colonial peoples, operated that business in New York City from the time that the British took control. The Dutch were only in control for less than 100 years.
But not in Hurley.
No, I mean, no.
I mean, they
there
were
was a long-
not officially in control, but
Right. the influence, yes.
they were, you know, they felt like they were in charge for sure. And reading Black Walden and some other materials, again, this is, you know, this whole project, I realized my own ignorance. I mean, so much of it is, you know, I read something and I'm like, oh, I can't believe I didn't know that. But so many states also enslaved Native American people. And New York had done that, and Stuyvesant made a law outlawing that after, I think, 1687. Although I was just talking to somebody recently who just sort of laughed and said, yeah, that was the law on the books, but that didn't mean that it didn't happen. So I was like, oh, yeah, right.
Okay. It looks like the questions, if there are any more questions, you can follow up with Lorna. Lorna, do you have any, would you welcome any follow-up questions after the fact? Do you want to share your email address?
Sure.
And I wish to thank you once again to you, Lorna, for your great presentation. We had a little technical challenge up front, but we soldiered on, and I think it was wonderful, very informative. I learned quite a lot. And to the audience, if you would like to review the presentation once again or share it with others, in a few days, we will have this posted for video streaming on our website, which is hurleyheritagesociety.org. Thanks to you, everyone, and your attendance. We had a great turnout this evening. I wish to let everyone know that our next presentation, which will also be online, is February 23rd. That's a Thursday at 7 p.m. And our guest presenter will be Glenn Kreisberg, author, outdoor guide, and researcher in Hudson Valley on Hudson Valley astroarchaeology and archaeology. He will speak on Native American stone structures in the Catskill Mountains. So look out for additional details on that presentation. It will be coming up. And thank you for coming out on a blustery evening. Thank goodness for the internet, right? And Lorna, again, thank you very much. I'll follow up with you offline over the next couple days. But again, your time and your research is most appreciated. Thank you for your gracious presentation and time.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Raleigh.
Take care. Good night.